The afternoon sun cast a golden glow over the bustling streets, a city alive with the rhythm of its people. Among them was Naomi, a young black woman with a determined spirit and dreams as vast as the horizon. Today she was headed to her new workplace, the culmination of months of effort, perseverance, and paperwork. The work permit in her bag wasn't just a piece of paper, it was a symbol of hope, a testament to her hard-fought journey in a world that often seemed stacked against her. As she walked, her polished shoes tapped rhythmically against the pavement, each step a declaration of her confidence. Naomi had every reason to hold her head high. She had worked tirelessly to secure her position, balancing late-night studies and an endless maze of bureaucratic red tape. This job wasn't just a paycheck, it was a doorway to a future she had long dreamed of. However, fate had other plans for Naomi that day. As she reached the steps of the office building, she noticed a commotion near the entrance. A police officer stood there, his posture rigid, his hand raised to halt her. "Excuse me, ma'am," he called out, his tone laced with authority. Naomi paused, confused but compliant. "Yes, officer," she replied, keeping her voice calm. "May I see your identification and any relevant documents?" he asked. His eyes scanned her from head to toe, a flicker of disdain briefly crossing his face. Naomi nodded, pulling out her work permit and ID card. As she handed them over, she noticed his lips curl into a smirk. "What's this?" he asked, holding up the permit as if it were a piece of trash. "It's my work permit," Naomi explained, her voice steady despite the unease creeping into her chest. "I'm starting a new position here today." The officer chuckled, a low, mocking sound that made Naomi's stomach twist. "Work permit, huh?" he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "And you think this is real?" Naomi's heart raced. "It is real," she replied, her tone firmer now. "Please handle it carefully." But the officer didn't listen. With a theatrical flourish, he pulled out a lighter from his pocket. Naomi's eyes widened in disbelief as the flame danced dangerously close to the paper. "Stop," she cried, stepping forward, but the officer held up a hand to block her. "Don't worry," he said, his grin widening. "Just doing my job, making sure no one's trying to cheat the system." And then, in one swift motion, he set the corner of the document ablaze. Naomi could only watch in horror as the flames consumed the permit she had worked so hard to obtain. She felt a mix of anger and helplessness, the weight of injustice pressing down on her. "Why would you do that?" she demanded, her voice shaking. The officer shrugged, his expression smug. "Because people like you think you can get away with anything. Not on my watch." Naomi stood frozen, her fists clenched, her mind racing with thoughts of how to salvage the situation. The flames had destroyed more than just a piece of paper, they had burned away a piece of her dignity. But what the officer didn't realize was that his actions would have consequences far beyond anything he could imagine. Unbeknownst to him, Naomi wasn't just another face in the crowd. She was married to one of the city's most influential figures, a man who commanded respect, not just because of his position, but because of his unwavering sense of justice. And that man was about to find out exactly what had happened. As Naomi turned and walked away, her back straight and her head high despite the tears threatening to spill, she knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Naomi's heels clicked steadily against the sidewalk, but her mind was far from calm. The warmth of the afternoon sun now felt suffocating, the heat pressing down on her as if the world itself bore witness to what had just happened. She walked with purpose, though each step felt heavier than the last. Her throat tightened, but she refused to let the tears fall. She had grown up learning to keep her composure no matter the situation. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind. "Don't give them the satisfaction, Naomi. Hold your head high." But this was different. By the time she reached the end of the block, her phone buzzed. She stopped and glanced down at the screen. It was Marcus. She hesitated before answering. Marcus, her husband, was the last person she wanted to worry with this. He already had enough on his plate. Between his role as regional director at one of the city's top firms and his constant advocacy for community reforms, Marcus was a man who rarely rested. Naomi admired his strength, but she knew how fiercely protective he could be. Still, the weight of the moment pressed down on her, and before she could convince herself otherwise, she swiped to answer. "Hey," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "Hey, beautiful," Marcus replied, his deep voice immediately grounding her. "I was just thinking about you. How's the first day going?" Naomi hesitated. For a brief moment, she considered brushing the incident aside, pretending it never happened. She could handle this herself. She'd done it before. But something inside her rebelled against the thought. She took a slow breath. Actually, something happened. Marcus' tone shifted instantly. What happened? Are you okay? I'm fine, Naomi said quickly, softening her tone. Really, it's just, there was this officer outside the building. He stopped me, asked for my papers, and she trailed off, unsure how to explain the rest without setting him off. And what? Marcus's voice was sharp now, concern bleeding through his words. Naomi bit her lip. He burned my work permit. Silence hung between them for a beat too long. He did what? Marcus's voice was low, but Naomi recognized the barely restrained anger beneath it. It's not a big deal, she tried to downplay it. I can get it replaced. It'll just take some time. No, Naomi, that's not okay. Marcus' breathing slowed, but she knew him well enough to sense the storm behind his calm exterior. I don't want you to do anything drastic, she said quickly. I just wanted you to know, that's all. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Do you know his name? His badge number? She sighed. I didn't get a chance to check. He seemed pretty confident I wouldn't make a fuss. Marcus exhaled through his nose, clearly holding something back. I'll handle it. Marcus. I said I'll handle it. Naomi closed her eyes. She knew better than to argue when Marcus got like this. He wasn't the type to raise his voice, but he had a way of making people listen. She appreciated that about him. Most of the time. I just don't want you to get in trouble over this, she said softly. I won't, Marcus promised. But he will. The line went quiet after that, and Naomi slipped her phone back into her bag. She glanced at the entrance to the office building one last time before heading toward the train station. There was no point in trying to explain the situation to her new employer without the permit. As she rode the train home, Naomi's thoughts wandered back to the officer's face. The way he had smiled as he flicked the lighter, the casual arrogance in his eyes, as if he had done this before. She couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't worried about consequences, because he had never faced them. The train rocked gently as it sped along the tracks, the cityscape blurring outside the window. Naomi rested her forehead against the glass, watching as familiar neighborhoods slipped past. By the time she reached their apartment, the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the city streets. Naomi lingered at the entrance to their building, her fingers brushing over the handle as if the cool metal could steady her. Upstairs, Marcus was already home, standing by the window with a phone pressed to his ear. He glanced over as she walked in, his dark eyes scanning her as if to check for any sign of distress. Yeah, I'll call you back, he said into the phone, ending the call as she set down her bag. Who was that? Naomi asked, slipping off her shoes. Just some at the station, Marcus replied. Naomi's brow furrowed. Marcus, I told you I'd handle it, he said, cutting her off gently. She stepped closer, searching his face. You can't fight every battle for me. I know, Marcus said, his gaze softening. But I can fight this one. Naomi sighed, letting her forehead rest against his chest. His arms circled around her, holding her close. I'm proud of you, you know, he murmured into her hair. I didn't do anything, she replied, her voice muffled against his shirt. You didn't back down, Marcus said. That's more than enough. For a long time, they stood like that, wrapped in quiet comfort. But even as the apartment filled with warmth and familiarity, Naomi couldn't shake the lingering feeling that the officer's smirk was burned into the back of her mind. And Marcus, she knew Marcus wouldn't let it go. The next morning arrived with a quiet stillness that seemed at odds with the undercurrent of tension Naomi felt. The sunlight filtering through the curtains painted soft patterns across the walls, but the weight in her chest hadn't lifted. Marcus had left early, slipping out quietly so as not to wake her, but Naomi could feel the lingering energy of his resolve in the empty space beside her. She sat at the kitchen table, sipping a lukewarm cup of tea as she scrolled through her phone. An email from the office sat unread in her inbox. It was a simple message asking her to confirm her start date. Naomi's thumb hovered over the screen, but she couldn't bring herself to reply yet. Her gaze drifted to the folded newspaper Marcus had left behind. The front page was filled with headlines about local politics, a missing teenager, and a small blurb about new community initiatives Marcus had been spearheading. His name was mentioned in passing, but she could practically hear his voice behind the carefully crafted words. Naomi sighed and set the phone down, folding her arms across the table. She tried to brush off the memory of the previous day, the officer's mocking expression, the fluttering ashes of her work permit, but it clung stubbornly to the edges of her mind. The knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. It was firm but not urgent, the kind of knock that didn't ask for permission. Naomi frowned, setting her cup aside as she rose to answer. When she opened the door, a familiar figure stood on the other side. Rachel, Naomi greeted with surprise, blinking at the woman standing in the hallway. Marcus's sister, impeccably dressed as always, offered a tight smile in return. "I figured you'd be home," Rachel said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Naomi closed the door behind her, curiosity flickering in her chest. Rachel rarely dropped by unannounced. Unlike Marcus, Rachel preferred to keep a healthy distance from anything resembling drama. She moved through the world with the same confidence Marcus carried, but there was an edge to her, like she could see 10 steps ahead in any given situation and was already preparing for the fallout. "I heard about what happened," Rachel said, setting her bag down on the counter. "Marcus mentioned it last night." Naomi tensed slightly. "He told you?" Rachel arched a brow. "You know Marcus, he doesn't let things like this slide." Naomi leaned against the counter, folding her arms. "I just didn't think he'd tell anyone else. I don't want this to turn into a bigger deal than it already is." Rachel gave a small laugh, but there was little humor in it. "Naomi, I don't think you understand who that officer is." Naomi's brows knit together. "I didn't even catch his name." "Well, I did," Rachel said. "His name is Officer Dean Mathers. And let's just say this isn't his first time pulling something like that." Naomi's stomach twisted. "What do you mean?" Rachel met her gaze evenly. "He's been under investigation before. Harassment complaints, excessive force. Nothing sticks. Every time someone tries to file something, the reports vanish. Witnesses suddenly forget details. It's like clockwork." Naomi swallowed hard, the familiar frustration rising. Rachel leaned in slightly. "Marcus isn't just upset about what happened to you. He's angry because he's been watching Mathers for months. And now, well," Rachel's lips pressed into a thin line. "Now Mathers just burned the wrong woman's permit." Naomi's pulse quickened. "I don't want Marcus to get dragged into something dangerous. If this officer has that much sway, it could backfire." Rachel's expression softened just a fraction. "You know Marcus. When he decides to stand for something, there's no talking him out of it." Naomi nodded, but the worried nod at her. Rachel straightened, adjusting the cuff of her blazer. "I came by to tell you to be careful, and to remind you that if things escalate, you let me know. I've got connections at the city office. If we need to pull strings quietly, we will." Naomi managed a small smile. "Thank you." Rachel returned the smile, but there was an unspoken weight between them. After Rachel left, Naomi found herself pacing the apartment, unable to shake the sense of unease. She wasn't naive. She knew how the system worked, how easily things could shift under the right pressure. Marcus might have been a man of influence, but even that had its limits. By afternoon, Naomi found herself back at the office building. The charred edges of where the incident happened still lingered in her mind as she approached. She wasn't there to confront anyone. Instead, she planned to speak to HR directly, hoping she could explain the situation and expedite the process for a new permit. But as she neared the entrance, a familiar voice drifted from the far end of the sidewalk. "Well, look who's back." Naomi's steps slowed. Officer Mathers leaned casually against the side of the building, his arms crossed, watching her with that same smug grin. "Surprised you're trying again," he remarked, pushing off the wall and strolling toward her. Naomi squared her shoulders, keeping her expression neutral. "I'm just here to speak to someone about replacing my permit." Mathers gave a low chuckle. "You people sure are persistent." Naomi's jaw tightened. "But hey," Mathers continued, his voice dropping slightly, "I'd be careful if I were you. Sometimes paperwork has a funny way of getting lost around here." She met his gaze head-on. "I'm not afraid of you." Mathers tilted his head as if weighing her words. Then he leaned in just slightly, voice barely above a whisper. "You should be." Naomi felt her pulse spike, but she didn't let it show. As she stepped past him and into the building, she could feel his eyes following her the entire way. Naomi sat quietly in the waiting area of the office, the soft hum of distant conversations filling the space around her. Despite the neutral beige walls and soft lighting, she felt the weight of Mathers' words hanging over her like a storm cloud. She couldn't shake the feeling that he was still outside, lingering just out of sight. Her fingers tapped lightly against her phone, the temptation to text Marcus growing stronger, but she knew what he would say. He'd tell her to stay calm, to keep her head down and trust him to handle it. That was always his way, controlled, methodical, patient. But Naomi had never been good at waiting when she felt a wrong needed to be righted. "Naomi." She looked up to see a woman from HR stepping forward, holding a clipboard. "Come with me," the woman said, offering a small smile. Naomi followed her through the corridor and into a modest office, where she was invited to sit across from the desk. "I understand you're here about a replacement work permit," the woman began, flipping through a few papers. "I reviewed your case, and I have to say, this situation is unusual." Naomi raised an eyebrow. "Unusual how?" The HR woman hesitated for a second, lowering her voice. "It seems there's no official record of the incident. I checked security footage from yesterday, and oddly enough, it's missing during the time you were here." Naomi felt her stomach drop. The woman continued, clearly sensing Naomi's discomfort. "I'm not sure what happened, but it's not the first time something like this has occurred. You should know there are whispers about certain officers tampering with records." Naomi's grip on the chair tightened. "Mothers." The woman didn't confirm it outright, but the brief flicker in her eyes was enough of an answer. "I'm going to escalate this internally," the HR rep added. "In the meantime, I'll process a new permit for you, but it might take a few days." Naomi forced a polite nod, but her thoughts were already racing ahead. Escalating it internally felt like throwing water at a bonfire. By the time any action was taken, Mathers would likely have moved on, leaving behind only another string of erased records. As Naomi left the office, she could feel the tension in her muscles. She didn't bother looking around for Mathers. Whether he was still outside or not didn't matter. She knew this wouldn't stop here. Later that evening, Naomi sat by the window, watching the faint glow of city lights reflect off the streets below. Marcus hadn't returned yet, and the apartment felt unusually quiet. Her mind kept replaying the HR woman's words. Missing footage. No official record. Her phone buzzed on the table. A message from Rachel popped up. "Any more trouble?" Naomi stared at the screen for a moment, considering how to respond. Her thumb hovered over the keyboard, but before she could type, the lock on the front door clicked. Marcus stepped inside, his expression unreadable as he set his briefcase down. "You're late," Naomi said softly, trying to mask the concern in her voice. Marcus exhaled, loosening his tie. "I was meeting with someone." She didn't need to ask who. Marcus crossed the room, resting a hand gently on her shoulder. "Naomi, I know you're worried, but you have to let me handle this." Her eyes met his. "How bad is it?" He hesitated, his silence answering more than any words could. Marcus finally spoke, his voice low. "Mathers isn't just targeting you. There are others. I've been gathering statements, but every time someone comes forward, the files disappear. It's deeper than I thought." Naomi's heart sank. "And now that he knows who you are," Marcus paused, clearly choosing his words carefully. "He's going to keep pushing." Naomi pressed her lips together, the flicker of defiance growing inside her. "So what do we do?" Marcus crouched down in front of her, taking her hands in his. "We don't let him intimidate us, but we play this smart. No sudden moves, no confrontations." She nodded, but the frustration still simmered beneath the surface. That night, as Marcus slept, Naomi lay awake staring at the ceiling. The shadows of the room seemed to stretch longer than usual, and the faint creaks of the apartment settled around her like whispers. At some point, she drifted into a light sleep, but just before dawn, a distant sound jolted her awake. A car engine idling. Naomi slipped out of bed carefully, padding to the window. Peering through the blinds, she saw a dark vehicle parked across the street. It sat there for several long minutes, the silhouette of someone behind the wheel barely visible in the dim light. And then, just as silently as it had come, the car pulled away, disappearing around a corner. Naomi stood there long after the street returned to silence, a pulse drumming softly in her ears. Naomi stood at the window long after the street had gone quiet. The dark car was gone, but its presence lingered in her thoughts like an unwelcome guest. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching, even as the city began to stir with the first light of morning. The warmth of Marcus's hand on her shoulder startled her slightly, and she turned to find him standing behind her, concern etched into his features. "You're up early," he said, his voice soft but alert. "I heard something," Naomi replied, glancing back out the window. "There was a car. It just sat there for a while." Marcus' eyes narrowed as he scanned the empty street below. He didn't ask questions. He simply nodded, as if this was something he had been expecting. "I'll make some calls," he said quietly. But Naomi could tell he was holding something back. She wanted to press him, but she knew Marcus well enough to understand when he was protecting her from something bigger. Instead, she let the conversation slip into silence, though the unease never faded. Later that day, Naomi found herself back at work, trying to lose herself in the rhythm of the office. The normalcy was welcome, even if the uneasiness clung to her like a second skin. By lunchtime, she decided to take a walk, hoping the fresh air would clear her mind. As she stepped outside, she nearly collided with Rachel, who was hurrying toward the entrance. "Naomi, I've been looking for you," Rachel said, her tone urgent. She glanced over her shoulder as if making sure no one else was listening. Naomi frowned. "What's wrong?" Rachel lowered her voice. "I overheard something this morning. Mathers is asking around about Marcus. Something about old case files." Naomi's pulse quickened. "Old case files?" Rachel nodded. "It didn't sound good. I think he's trying to dig up anything he can use against him." Naomi felt a cold weight settle in her chest. Mathers wasn't just content to intimidate her. Now he was going after Marcus directly. "Thanks for telling me," Naomi said, forcing a small smile despite the worry gnawing at her. Rachel hesitated, her eyes flickering with uncertainty. "Be careful, Naomi. Mathers plays dirty. You know that?" Naomi nodded, watching as Rachel disappeared back into the office building. By the time Naomi returned home that evening, Marcus was already there, pacing near the kitchen with his phone pressed to his ear. His expression darkened as he listened to whoever was on the other end. "I understand," Marcus said sharply before ending the call. "What's going on?" Naomi asked, setting her bag down carefully. Marcus sighed, running a hand over his face. "It's Mathers. He's pulling records from one of my old cases. A closed case, but he's trying to spin it into something it's not." Naomi crossed her arms, frustration bubbling to the surface. "He's not going to stop, is he?" Marcus met her gaze, the weight of his silence answering the question. For the next few days, Naomi kept her head down, but every glance over her shoulder felt heavier. Marcus tried to stay one step ahead of Mathers, but the tension in their apartment thickened with each passing evening. Then, one night, Marcus came home with a file tucked under his arm. Naomi watched as he placed it on the table and opened it carefully, his expression guarded. "What is that?" Naomi asked, moving closer. Marcus hesitated for a beat. "It's from Mathers' personnel record." Naomi's eyes widened. "How did you get that?" "I didn't," Marcus replied carefully. "Someone left it on my desk this morning." Naomi's gaze dropped to the file, curiosity tugging at her. As Marcus flipped through the pages, his expression shifted from confusion to realization. "Naomi." Marcus's voice trailed off, his eyes scanning the document in front of him. "Mathers isn't who he claims to be." Naomi leaned in, her eyes catching the words printed at the top of one page. "Suspension of duty, internal investigation." Marcus's finger traced down the lines of text, pausing at a section marked confidential. "This isn't just about intimidation," Marcus said quietly. "Mathers was under investigation for tampering with evidence 2 years ago. They couldn't prove anything, so the case was buried. But someone's brought it back to the surface." Naomi's mind raced. Why now? Marcus closed the file, leaning back in his chair. "Because someone else wants Mathers out of the picture." Naomi's stomach twisted. "Are they using us to do it?" The realization settled over them both like a heavy fog. They weren't just dealing with Mathers anymore. This was bigger. And whoever was behind it was pulling the strings from the shadows.